Today we are going to be doing some work in Perashat Ki Te'se. This week's class is dedicated in loving memory of Grace Towel, Grace Bat Rachel Aleha Shalom, and Renee Levy, Rini Bat Rachel Aleha Shalom, by Esther Adis. I miss you, Esther. Thank you for sponsoring our class today, and I look forward to being able to learn together soon. If you could open your Chumashim, please, to Perashat Ki Te'se in the book of Devarim. If you're following in the blue Stone Edition books, it's on page 1046. Before we read that first pasuk, I'd like to do something maybe a little different today. I'd like to look at the verses possibly in a way that would really be more relevant and timeless, because if we just look at the parshiyot, the laws and the commands in the way that they are presented to us, they seem a little bit like a hodgepodge. It seems like a conglomeration, a compilation of possibly unrelated laws. But of course, since the Torah is perfect, there is a perfect format to what is going on in Perashat Ki Te'se. And to add an extra level, I'd like to see its relevance for us today. So we'll start with the first pasuk in Perashat Ki Te'se. It says, Ki Te'se lemilchama al oivecha, untano Hashem Elohecha beyadecha, veshavita shivyo. I'm going to, as best as I can, translate it to the English. It says, Ki te'se, if or when you are to go out to war on your oivecha, as opposed to sonecha, on those who wish to harm you rather than those who hate you. Unetano, and God will give in your hand. The victory is literally in your hands. And then we have these words, Veshavita shivyo. It might be a little bit of a irregular way to express that you will capture its captivity. And so if we just start with the word ki and realize that what's taking place here is not just a mention of time when you go to war, but a causative ki. The entire reason for your going to war is to be able to capture something. Veshavita, and we're going to want to play with those words a little bit, but first let's understand, what does it mean, te'se lemilchama? Where do we have that term te'se? What does te'se mean? It could have said telech lemilchama, maybe we go to war. Why specifically this word te'se? This might start to give us a little bit of a sense of really how the Torah is speaking in timeless terms. If we wanted to go, of course, to the first Te'se, which we always like to do, why not? It would be in Bereshit, chapter 30, verse 16. If you're following in the Art Scroll, in the Stone Edition, it's page 156. And it happens to be that the person who is Vatetze, who is going out, you'll remember the story, is Yaakov comes from the Sadeh after the whole exchange with the Dudaim, with her and Rachel, Vatetze Leah. And Leah comes out, and she comes to greet him, and she says, it's my turn tonight, because Sachor secharticha bedudae beni. I have acquired you, you are my reward, so to speak, for the dudaim that my son had given Rachel. What in the world does this Vatetze with Leah going out and taking and staking her claim to Yaakov. What could that possibly have to do with our Vatetze LaMilchama? There is something, and the next two Vatetzes will confirm it, but I just want to do them briefly because I want to start to set the stage for the idea that when we have a Vatetze, it means that we are the ones that are initiating and going out there, and we are looking to either change or hopefully improve our destiny. All of a sudden, Vatetze lemilchama aloivecha is starting to speak to us as well today, is do you want to get up and do you want to get out and do you want to wage war? Do you want to fight this battle against these forces that wish us harm? I'm going to give you the other two quickly just so you get a better sense of it. And the Mefarshim have a field day with this because the next one is Vatetze Dina, and they connect the two Vatetzes and they say, oh, since Leah was so out there and she went out to stake her claim, Vatetze Dina, she also, like mother, like daughter, this is not me, this is a commentary saying, she was also forward and she was also out there. In her case, she went lidot bibinot ha'ir. She went to see, she was seeking out the locals. She wanted to see or make a connection with the people that were at that time in Shechem. And when Dina goes out, for her, it's not such a good story. Vatetze Dina, she goes out, and we all know her story, how she ends up getting kidnapped by Chamor, and I'm not going to go into that story today, but Vatetze is also shown here as somebody who is going out, who does want to change her destiny, but in this case, it wasn't such a happy ending. I'm going to give you the third Vatetze of Bereshit, and then I want to really go into the idea of what it means for us today. The third one's in chapter 42, verse 15, and Bereshit as well. And I think this is going to speak very strongly to our parasha this week. I know they seem like three unconnected vatetzes, but we'll see how the Torah is going to connect them for us this week. It's page 234. This is Yosef speaking to his brothers after having accused them of being spies. And he says these words. He says, Bezot tibachanu. This is how you will be judged. Paro, by the life, swearing on the life of Paro. Im tetz'u mizeh. If you're going to be able to get out of this pickle that you got yourselves into. Ki im bevo achichem hakaton hema. The only way that you're going to be able to get out of this pickle is by bringing me your younger brother. What on earth does that have to do with our Ki Te'se LeMilchama? So now we're going to go back. And just if you wanted to get a sense of the root word, the Vayetze word, that word also, Vayetze Kayin. Kayin, it goes out, he has a change in destiny. Vayetze Noach, when he's going to come out of the Teva, he finally, it's actually before he goes out, the raven goes out, and then he goes out. This idea of Vayetze, Vatetze, is now going to take on a whole new form in our Perashat this week, because I want to play with these words where it says that Unetano Hashem Elohecha beyadecha. God's saying, I'm handing something to you on a silver platter, or to use an idiom from today, it's at your arm's reach. It's right in your grasp. I'm offering you something that's in your grasp, and what I'm offering you is the ability to conquer or defeat those forces that want to harm you. And if you do that, then you will return, or you will reclaim, or you will restore, shavit shivyo. You will restore those things that are being held captive, those things that are imprisoned right now, those things that may have actually come very close to destruction. I'm presenting it this way because I believe that this parasha is no different than the other parshiyot that we've been reading in Sefer Devarim. The parshiyot that have been saying, it's time for you to come into the land. And in order to come into the land, we need to start to reorient the direction in which we position ourselves. The entire time in the desert, we had a vertical existence. It was just us and God. And as we moved forward through Shemot, Vayikra, B'midbar, God started to expand that relationship that was just us and Him into this more horizontal existence. Get judges, how we treat our friends, the Adam Lechavero, relationships. And we started to really branch out horizontally. Last week, we started to understand that it's not just about going up and going out, but there is an inward movement that Moshe is beckoning us towards. And it's saying, in order for us to come back to the land, what does it mean to come back to the land? To live an existence that is healthy, that is nurturing, that will bring us a sense of peace, peace from our enemies without, but also a peace from our enemies within. I think that's one of the pieces that I don't want to go through Sefer Devarim missing out on. I think the Torah is very, very sensitive to understand that we have, within us, we have internal forces, there's a whole internal world that's going on in our own mind. And before we go into Eretz Yisrael and we conquer those external forces and the external war, the first thing that we have to do is really make peace with our own inner selves. This parasha is not just talking about recovery, because we are in recovery mode. We're coming back to a land that we had once left. It's also discussing discovery, how we could discover ourselves. And the Torah does it in a very beautiful way, because the next verse says, Vera'ita b'shivya eshet yefat to'ar. We've had this terminology before. We've had an Isha yefat to'ar before. The Isha Yefat To'ar that I am describing was actually Rachel. I don't think that the Torah would just use the same words for a haphazard woman that we might encounter in our conquests and use the same exact language to describe Rachel. And the next chapter, if you just want to go to the next Parshiyah, it goes further and it says in verse 15, if a man, an ish, we know Yaakov was called an ish, if a man has two nashim, has two wives, one is loved, and we know that it said that Yaakov loved Rachel, ve'ha'achat senua, and the other one is hated, and it was clear, it said about Leah that she felt that she was senua, that she was hated, and he has children. There is the loved one has children, and the hated one has children, but the Bechor belongs to the hated one. We'll use the name Reuven just for our analogy right now. So Torah is saying something very important. You can't take the Bechorah from the biologically eligible Bechor and give that privilege to the son of the wife that you love. This to me is very much in keeping with the Yaakov story, his two wives, what took place with those brothers, and all of a sudden now what starts to ring in our minds is, I understand why Vatetse. I understand why Yosef's brother's having to connect with the youngest brother. There needs to be some type of cohesion. There needs to be a peace amongst brotherhood in order for there to be a return back into the land. This whole story now, I should just tell you that the Mefarshim do a very good job of looking at these verses as a succession, saying if you marry a woman who is from one of the conquered lands, then you're going to end up having a wife. You're going to bring her into your family, and now there's going to be two wives, rival wives. And then the next Parshiya talks about the Ben Sorer Umorer. There's a very good chance that the children are going to pay the price for it. And the Mefarshim go about how to keep peace and maintain peace in your home and how the breakdown could easily happen. And that's how they explain these verses. Today, I'd like to actually take these verses and understand that if we want to move forward, if we want to come into Eretz Yisrael, then we have to understand how our nation was built. We have to understand our own origins, so to speak, but not just how our nation was built, how we ourselves were created as individuals. Now, Yaakov, and I'm going to be speaking a lot about him because I believe that this is pointing to that direction. First of all, Yaakov also had to make a journey back into the land. And in making his journey back into the land, he was going to have encounters and he was going to have challenges and struggles. He was going to have to pass through his brother Esav, if you'll remember. And just in case I forget to make note of it later, our Perashat starts out with one type of war, and it ends with a different type of war. The end of Perashat Ki Te'se, you might well know, is Perashat Zachor, the famous parasha that we read before Purim, because it talks about remembering the Amalek, remembering what he did to us on the way. Amalek is a descendant of Esav, Yaakov's brother. So we're starting now our parasha saying, if you want to be able to conquer the outside world and all the countries, and you want to come back to a place where you could restore peace, to a place where right now there may be certain parts that are being held captive or that aren't able to express themselves, if you go and you decide to fight this battle, says the first pasuk, Ki Te'se le'milchama, then you know what's going to happen? God's going to help you, and God's going to deliver this victory into your hands. So the battle with the self, so to speak, the first one that has to take place, we're going to talk about what that means in a minute, but that battle is, the Torah does a beautiful thing. Rather than tell us that we have constant battles and that our minds are in a constant state of searching for equilibrium, it does a much easier thing for us. It's hard for us to look in the mirror and see ourselves that way. So instead, it allows us to see ourselves through the prism of Yaakov and through the prism of his two wives. And it's going to fracture Yaakov, so to speak. It's going to make him two people, not so that I could psychoanalyze him, but so that I could understand that we all we all are a form, so to speak, of Yaakov. Meaning, Yaakov has two names, Yaakov and Yisrael. He has two wives, Rachel and Leah. And he has a lot of inner struggle. I don't have to remind you about that whole struggle that he had with that Ish where he got hit in the Gid Hanasheh. I think this is saying that we all have a part of Yaakov within us. And so in understanding where the Torah is taking us down this path, I'd like to put it as simply as possible to say that every person is, because we're trying to understand the mitzvot, and we want to understand what the mitzvot mean to us. And so I'd like to say that the mitzvah, every mitzvah and every person has something in common. Every person has a body and a soul, and every mitzvah has a body and a soul. Right now, we started to talk about this first mitzvah about going out to war. The body of the mitzvah is the physical, actual act of going out to war. I never want to undermine or underestimate the actual body of the mitzvah, which is going out to war and bringing back captives. That is the body. But there's another component to every mitzvah that makes the mitzvah timeless, that makes it last for eternity. And the job every week is ours. If we see a mitzvah that seems outdated or no longer relevant, we have to sort of find a component of the mitzvah that still applies to us today. I'm going to use the word metaphysical. There's a metaphysical part to every single mitzvah. The Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, do a lot of work on this, understanding the parts of the mitzvah that are not specifically written, but understanding what the essence of the mitzvah is and how it nourishes us. So I'll start with this. The physical part of the mitzvah is what's most closely correlated to our physical part. It's what we do. But the other part of the mitzvah, the soul of the mitzvah, so to speak, is what affects our soul. And that's why we're still learning Torah, and that's why we're still learning these laws. Even though we're not in a desert about to enter Eretz Yisrael right now, we are going to always be in a perpetual state of wanting to grow and get to the next level. And that's how these mitzvot will help us, and they'll allow us to find this type of balance. Now, when we have conflict, when we have an oivecha, when we have inside of us some type of an inner conflict, that creates an imbalance between the soul and the body, or within ourselves, within our minds. So right now, for today, we're going to look at a few of the laws that are in this week's Perashah, and we're going to look at what the tangible, physical act of the mitzvah is, which is its body. And then we want to try and see if we could understand the soul part of the mitzvah, which is the part that embodies the psychological or the spiritual meaning behind the mitzvah. And so let's move forward. I will say this, I think I did, but I'll repeat it. The body of the mitzvah may not always be applicable. We can't always bring a korban. We can't always find a para aduma. We can't always do certain things because it's the timing and the world we're living in right now doesn't allow for it. But the soul of the mitzvah is always timeless. It's always relevant. And that's what we're looking for today. So I'd like to suggest today, I do a lot of work. I'm fascinated by Yaakov, by the life he lived, by all of the drama. I believe there's a lot there that we could learn from. I'd like to start by suggesting from the verses that we read in Perashat Ki Te'se, that maybe Yaakov had two wives because he was in a state of conflict himself. He was fractured, and he needed one wife for each of his selves. What I mean by that is, if you'll remember how he was when he left Be'er Sheva, on his way to Haran, how he vayifga b'makom vayalen sham. We said that he was in a state of complete, possibly depression, possibly suicidal. I've suggested before that that even that he puts by his head could have even been his own tombstone. I don't mean to be graphic or gory, but I think that God came to him at that very time because he had nothing to live for. At that point, he was already humiliated by his brother, to his father, of himself. He's penniless, and he's going out into the wild blue yonder without knowing what his future holds. He was in a tough state, Yaakov. And so when a person is conflicted, their body and soul is not in sync. His body at this point is lying down, and it kept telling us, Vayalin, Vayishkav, Vayishen, all verbs that talk about his horizontality, his sort of giving up state of surrender. And God comes to him at that exact point, and he comes to him in a dream. And the dream is God's way of approaching him from not the physical, not the body part, but from the metaphysical. He's speaking more to his soul than is speaking to his body. I'm using this terminology because I want to say what God was trying to show Yaakov at that point was, stop being so defeated. Stop getting inside your own head and stop giving yourself a narrative that it's all over and there's nothing worth living for. And what God shows him is he shows him a totally different orientation. He shows him this verticality, this ladder, this stairway to heaven, this way to connect, to say, listen, whatever your narrowed prism of your existence is right now, however you see yourself right now, that's not the whole picture. If you take a couple of steps up this ladder, you'll see the world from a completely different perspective. I believe Perashat Ki Te'se is going to be our spiritual ladder. It's going to be a way for us to understand that what's taking place in our bodies or in our minds has a completely another vista to it if we're open to it and if we're willing to fight that battle, so to speak. And just to tie a few bows around the Yaakov story, maybe that's why Rachel is presented to us when Yaakov meets her at the well. She's presented to us as Yefat To'ad, Yefat Mar'eh. She's very beautiful. All of her physical features are highlighted for us. And then we hear that Yaakov cries. And there's a lot written up about it. Rashi goes, and now I finally, all these years later, I understand what Rashi must have meant when he said he cried because he saw that he wouldn't be buried with her in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. And I said, it never really resonated with me. I couldn't understand what he meant by that until I came to Perashat Ki Te'se and I started to realize that what Yaakov was crying about is that Rachel was going to be the wife. I told you he was fractured. So Rachel was going to be the wife that represented his body, the physical, the here, the now. Leah, on the other hand, was going to be the wife that represented his eternity. And that for him was a very strong reality to accept. What happens is Leah, if we wanted to say that she represents the part that is attracted, that Yaakov is attracted to on a metaphysical level with his soul, let's say, it would make, so now when I say that, it means that Leah is going to be his timeless wife, his wife for eternity, his wife that's going to transcend the here and the now. And for her, I went back and looked, it said, Einei Leah rakot, her eyes were, and the English might call it soft or dim, but the truth of the matter is I went back to see how Yitzchak's eyes were described, and it says, Vatekahena einav, his eyes were weak, and then it says, with his weak eyes, it was clear that Yitzchak couldn't see. That's how the whole deception with Yaakov and Esav happened in the first place, because he didn't have regular, actual, physical vision. He may have had metaphysical vision, Yitzchak, but his physical eye test, he did not have that 20/20 vision, so to speak, in the physical world. I don't think that Leah's eyes being rakot means that she couldn't see. I think she had perfect vision. I think her eyes being soft might have been an allusion now to what Rashi had said about Rachel. Now I understand Leah. The eyes are the window to the soul. And her eyes being soft means she had a very easy way, a very easy access. It was a very fluid motion to go from the physical to the spiritual when it came to Leah. And so Leah and Rachel are each, I'm spending a little time with them because we have to go back into our Perashat and say, hey, wait a minute. You forgot to mention that one is loved and one is hated. I didn't forget to mention that. I think the entire purpose is to start to tell us, if we only understood, I'll rephrase that. If Yaakov understood that each of his wives represented another facet of himself, then he may have had a different view or impression of them. The problem with Yaakov, which is the problem with everyone, I told you I'm not analyzing Yaakov, this is for us to understand ourselves, but it's so much easier for us to put it on him. And the problem there was that Yaakov himself didn't recognize, I'll use this term, his whole self. He did not see, he did not go up the ladder in his own mind a couple of steps to see everything that he was comprised of. And so here, and of course we're going to see that later on, when he has that struggle, and many of the commentaries say that the struggle is an internal struggle that he has with himself, he's given an additional name. The rest of Sefer Bereshit calls him by both of those names. And I think it would be now, I've studied the names and where they appear, and I've made charts for myself, but now with this new level of understanding, perhaps Yaakov was attached to Rachel, but Yisrael is attached to Leah. And until he cultivates that part of himself, Leah undergoes an entire metamorphosis. She undergoes an entire change because she finally understands that in order for her to find her place in the world and to find her peace and to find her balance, she finally finds it with Yehuda. She realizes that her happiness is not tied to something external to her. It's not going to be because Yaakov sees her differently, or because Yaakov hears her differently, or my husband's going to now. Has nothing to do with your husband. That's what Ki Te'se milchama al oivecha. Before you go and fight all those external wars, the first war we have to fight is the one that's right between our ears, is right inside our head. And the Torah is going to give us a how-to. And in its genius in giving us a how to fight those battles, it'll give us the prototype, the person who is able to conquer those battles. Sarita, im Elohim ve'im anashim. It's something where you have to really be able to fuse and celebrate both parts of ourselves. And so now we're going to keep going to understanding. Maybe we'll take one more law from this week's Perashah, because I think it speaks to the same story. Now we're getting a little bit of a sense. I'll say this from here. On the metaphysical sense, every one of these laws is actually speaking about us and a different facet of ourselves. Whether it speaks about the captive woman, or the wife that we love and the wife that we don't love, whether it speaks about the son who is wayward. I'm going to use the example of the Yibum, which comes towards the end, the Levirate marriage, which comes towards the end of our Perashah, to sort of enforce this idea that when we read Torah and it talks about certain situations, it also has an additional aspect. And I want us to climb the ladder now and see if we can get new perspectives on these age-old laws. So if you turn to page 1062, right on the bottom, it's chapter 25 in our Perashah, verse 5. Ki yeshvu. Yes, we're talking about brothers who may happen to live together. They had a tribal existence, but maybe velo yachlu lashevet yachdav. Maybe earlier verses will start to come to us, whether it's Avraham and Lot, or whether it's Yosef and his brothers. This idea of brothers not being able to get along, now they're saying the opposite. They're saying if brothers can get along, umet echad mehem, but one of them dies, uben enlo, and the one who dies doesn't have a child, lo tihiyeh eshet hamet, the wife of the brother who died should not marry hachutza leish zar, should not marry a foreign person, an outsider. Yevama, her brother-in-law, yavo aleha, should come to her and take her as a wife and perform this thing that we call yibum. Yibum, just so we all are on the same page. The brother-in-law marries the sister-in-law that was married to his brother and never had children. The next verse is going to tell us exactly what the purpose of this union is. That the Bechor in verse 6, Haya Bechor Asher Teled, the Bechor that is born, Yakum al Shem Achiv Hamet. This woman who lost her husband should become pregnant from her brother-in-law, have a child, and that child, that first child, should be able to resurrect the name of her past husband, Velo Yimache Shemo B'Yisrael, so that his name will not be lost in Yisrael. We have a little bit of experience with this when it comes to the Ruth story, where Boaz comes and marries her, lehakim et shem hameh, to bring back the name of the deceased. So let's talk about this. It's a little bit challenging, but I think we're up to the task. If we had to separate this to a body and the soul, take the mitzvah and speak about the body of the mitzvah, which is the actual physical union between a widow and her brother-in-law. That's easy. What would the soul of this mitzvah be? What would the metaphysical counterpart of this mitzvah be? There is a symbolic marriage that takes place between a spiritual widow and a spiritual brother-in-law. What does that even mean? What is the metaphysical component? So if we had to really go back to the first place where we saw Yibum taking place, to the closest that we could imagine, we would think of Yehuda and Tamar, for instance. Thousands of years ago, Tamar marries Yehuda, and that sort of puts us in a certain mindset. Tamar marries Yehuda. Where is Yehuda at this point in his time? He's in his deepest, darkest abyss. He is blaming himself. I'm sure he doesn't sleep at night, and he wakes up every morning asking himself, how is it possible that I was the one that orchestrated not only Yosef's sale and disappearance, but my father's white hair and sense of unyielding grief. How did this happen? The guy's walking around in a daze. He can't see straight. He actually, vayered, he goes down, he goes to Timnah, he marries a woman. He has children that are terrible. The two of his first children die. I mean, he's really, really in a bad place at this point, Yehuda. But it's at this particular point that he's able to actually recover, and not only recover physically, but recover eternally. So we're going to have to talk about that, because this Yibum, he's actually the one that's going to perform the Yibum. He's going to perform a marriage. He's not the brother-in-law to Tamar. He's actually the father-in-law, but he's the stand-in for Shelah, for that youngest son. So since he didn't give Shelah to her, he's sort of giving himself to her. So we're going to allow ourselves, we're going to give ourselves a little leeway to say that Yehuda's performance of the Levirate marriage was in Shelah's stead. And when the Torah starts to describe for us, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav, brothers living together, yes, it's talking. This is where we really have to sort of stretch our minds a little bit. It's so much easier to just understand that the brothers that are living together are either Avraham and Lot, or Yosef and his brothers. But in Torah, when we hear the phrase brothers living together, it could also be two forms of our human emotions living together. I'll explain it even better. Yaakov is the perfect person for us to reference in this parasha, because he was originally a twin, and he lived together with his brother in the womb. When they left the womb and ultimately separated, Yaakov lost a half of himself. His Esav counterpart, that part that would have made him one, the part that would have made him whole and complete, is no longer existing, and he needs to sort of like generate a new limb. He needs to create another part to himself, because now he's missing. Those two together were comprising one, right? These two were supposed to work in tandem. And when they separated, Yaakov now needed a second wife, he needed a second name, he needed a new identity, he needed a new perspective. He was lost, he was literally half a person, he was torn. And so when brothers can't live together, or this idea of brothers that, let's say that they can live together, it's a more positive way to present it. If brothers can live together, what is it that allows for brothers to live together? It means that everybody's whole and everybody's balanced in and of themselves, and therefore could relate to everybody around them. So if Yosef can't live with his brothers, or his brothers can't live with him, it means that there's an imbalance somewhere in that equation. And so the two categories of emotions that have to live together within one person, those two achim, the two achim that are in our heads, so to speak, those two siblings that are in our head have to actually come to peace, are described in two categories. The first one is the conscious, our conscious emotions, our awareness, our cognition, the emotions that we feel on a daily basis that cover the entire spectrum of our life. That's the first category of emotions. Now, those emotions have to be able to live together in peace with that second category. Again, it goes back to the body and the soul, to the physical and the metaphysical, to the awareness that there's something more to our existence than the here and the now. So if the first category of emotions is the conscious, then you could already guess that that second category of emotions is going to be that mysterious place. The second brother is going to sort of embody the super conscious. It's going, I don't have a good terminology. My vocabulary is very limited in trying to express this concept of emotions and feelings that are outside of our awareness. They're those things that we can't really put our finger on. We know they're there. I could use the word, it's the spiritual, it's something sort of maybe beyond us, but still attached and part of us. And again, I'll use Yaakov as the example. Maybe a dream could be in the realm of this second brother. Dreams, and that's why it's so interesting that both Yaakov and Yosef dream. Yosef has to dream because his physical here and now, his body part, has to now create or come in peace with his own inner transcendent self, with this dream that tells him he's going to be a king, because he's not at peace with his own actual physical brothers. I'm going to explain it a little better when we go back into the Levirate marriage, but it could also be seen as a survival mechanism for people who want to escape reality. They have this other place. Now, you can't live in only one or the other. We said a balanced person is able to balance these two brothers, our mental brothers. We're able to put them together. And so I'll just go back to our Perashat to maybe try and simplify it. Ki yeshvu achim yachdav really describes a situation of a healthy, functioning individual where both of his selves are able to live together in peace. His superconscious, that place, the place where there is the intangible place, is able to inspire his physical self. And when a person is in this state, they are able to form relationships with people outside of them. If they can't be at peace with themselves, then it's going to be a lo yachlu lashevet yachdav, lo yachlu dabro leshalom. It's very hard to communicate with other people if your own brothers in your own head aren't working together, so to speak. That's what two brothers represent, this one healthy individual. And then we start to understand that that's what will yield children and grandchildren, because we're able to impact the future when we are one healthy self, when we're at peace with ourselves, when our emotions are balanced. And this is where we are able to create all this space for other people, for things that are larger than ourselves. But here in our Perashah, they tell us something tragic. They say sometimes there's a situation where one of the brothers dies childless. Now, if you're able to really go with this model, this understanding that the brother that we're talking about that died childless could actually be a part of the self that for whatever reason encountered a trauma and now has atrophied and now has died. Now that a part of us that was had love and enthusiasm, that had caring, that had a will, if that part becomes extinguished, what would happen to a person? And the Torah is speaking to that, saying very carefully and clearly to let us all know that we could easily, any one of us, in our war that we're fighting every day, in our minds, in our heads, it is possible that like two brothers with one of them dying, a part of us could also find itself numb, frozen, paralyzed, shut off. That first brother, the one that gives, the life, emotions that give us passion, if that brother isn't alive and well, then what is the Torah saying? It's saying we cannot succumb to emptiness. We cannot succumb to despair, God forbid addiction, God forbid cutting ourselves off from the people that we love. When that whole, I'll call it flow of inspiration, when that whole flow of inspiration is stopped, then we wither, we go into like a cocoon. We could isolate ourselves from the world, from our loved ones, God forbid. And this is what the Torah is speaking about, being childless. Childless means that if you're unmotivated, then that impact is going to stop us from creating things that are going to outlast ourselves, so to speak. As we move forward, I'd like for us to start to understand, let me see what time it is, 10:50, okay. I'd like for us to try and understand what is it that we can do in order to make sure that this situation, either, look, we can't make sure that it doesn't happen because life happens and situations happen, and we find ourselves in places where sometimes we feel like somebody turned off a light, and there are challenges like this Levirate marriage. The husband dies, he's childless, and the wife is left. Literally, that the physical part, the body of this mitzvah is speaking to that concept, where the wife is actually left without the ability to continue. And the Torah is here, and it's very generous for us. And the first thing it does in this week's Perashah is it starts to say, you need to see yourselves as a warrior. Ki Te'se milchama. This is war, the Torah is saying. This is a matter of life and death. Finding yourselves in this scenario means that in order to succeed, in order to be able to get up and to arise and to be able to move forward, know that this is a battle, and you have to fight your inner enemy, and you cannot give up. Giving up is literally the worst thing. Then we also have to realize, and I love that we're using Yaakov as an example, because we have to also realize we're not perfect, and nobody's perfect. And if we think that we're perfect, or we need to be, then we're always going to be at war with ourselves. And so the Torah is saying, stop it. Moshe wasn't perfect. Yaakov, nobody was perfect. So stop striving for perfection. Instead, strive for peace. Find a way to make peace with who you are. Of course, try and be your best self, but striving for peace instead of perfection is more attainable, and it's actually more humbling. And then the next thing that I think the Torah is saying also is we have to be careful to not burn out. We have to be careful like Yaakov. He was literally at that point when he went to lie down, he was physically and mentally exhausted. We try to achieve things, we put all our energies into them, we don't sleep. And then what happens? God forbid we could burn out before we reach our goal. And the Torah is saying that would be a form of self-sabotage. And if we're exhausted, when we're tired, that's when we're the most vulnerable. So sometimes we have to rest, but never quit. And part of this idea is when we find ourselves in these places, I'll use the Levirate marriage as an example, we start to get existential on ourselves, and we start to ask questions. What's life all about anyway? What's the meaning? What am I doing here? And the Torah wants us to say, rather than become existentialists, first of all, these questions don't have answers in the physical world. So we're better off not fighting this war. Not all wars can be won. Not all questions can be answered. But rather than ask ourselves questions that we already know we don't have answers to, we could ask ourselves questions that we can answer. We could ask ourselves questions, not why am I here, or things that I can't do. We could ask ourselves the questions of, what can I do? What do I have? What does work? What is productive about me? And if we start in this manner, we'll start to discover things about ourselves. We'll start to learn about ourselves. And the truth is, if you want to win your own inner battle, then you have to know your enemy, right? That's the first law of the art of war, is know your enemy. Well, you need to know yourself. If your oivecha, that you're going out in a milchama to fight, is your own inner self, then we have to fight ourselves, so to speak, by knowing ourselves, by never giving up. And knowing ourselves, which is also a very important philosophy, I often use the image of a treadmill. Movement is a very important part of recovery. Movement means that if you're not moving, de lo mosif yasef, life keeps moving. Life is moving forward with or without us. And so if we stay still, don't try this at home. If you ever try standing still on a treadmill, what would happen is you would actually go flying off. The treadmill would keep going and would sort of whip you backwards. Because life doesn't wait. You have to keep moving. And when you plow forward, we create this mental toughness, and we're able to face our adversities. And so if we want to leave ourselves with a psychological image of what the Torah is portraying for us, it's saying that our physical part, the part that we can see for ourselves, many psychologists describe as being the tip of the iceberg. There's an iceberg that we can just see the tip, but we can't see what else is going on beneath there. And so we could go for a psychoanalysis, and we can hire surfers and divers to go underneath and help us see the things that we can't see. That would be really more secular psychological view. I believe the Torah ascribes to a different view of seeing our entire selves. Seeing our entire selves is more like a traveling through life in a glass bottom boat, where we can see the bottom of the boat is glass, so we can see what's underneath us. The only difference is that when we look, we could only see under where we are positioned. And that takes us back to the idea of constant movement. If we stay in one place, we will only have one vista. We will only be able to see what that place allows our perspective to see. But if we have the strength, the bravery, the will to move that boat, move it 6 feet, 10 feet, 30 feet, all of a sudden what we see underneath that boat, that glass floor, will be a completely different view. And here the Torah is saying, Te'se le'milchama. The first thing you have to do is Te'se. You need to go out there. You know, when Leah went out there, she had Yisachar. I think it's telling us with the first Vatetse is that if you want to be rewarded, you want to go to a place that's going to change your destiny, that's going to change your reality, that's going to change your perspective, Vatetse. You need to move. And in moving, know that the hardest thing to move is yourself, your physical self, and to move and change your perspective. If we're able to do that, then Unetano Hashem Elohecha. You know what God is going to do? He's going to give you an avenue or a way to reclaim Veshavita Shivyo. You can reclaim those things that you may have thought were irrevocably gone and lost, those feelings inside of you that you thought you could never again attain or enjoy. Veshavita Shivyo. And you know who does all that? It's Hashem Elohecha. It's the God that has created us to be creators. The God that has given us dominion over the world. The God who's telling us, I'm putting this in your hand. This is up to you. You can look at your lives and your lot and your place and say, this is what Hashem gave me. Hashem saying, I didn't give you that. I gave you a glass bottom boat that all you had to do is row a couple of feet away from yourself and see an entire different world. So in going to the promised land, yes, Yaakov had to find his way into the promised land, and he had to go through his struggles in order to get there. We all have struggles that we need to overcome. We all have voices in our heads. We all have brothers in our heads that need to become united. But the Torah is telling us, whether it's through the Levirate marriage or ultimately, I'll just end with this with my last 1 minute that I think I have. The Torah ends with Zachor. Use your memory. Use your mind to move yourself, to propel yourself forward. Remind yourselves what happens when you are ayef, when you are yageya, when you don't have a sense of awe in God. This is the way I'd like to see the words of Parashat Zachor. When you don't, when you are ayef, when you're tired, you give up, you're physically exhausted or you're mentally exhausted. Your yirat Elohim, your awe, your sense of awe of God, your sense of being able to get up that ladder and see the angels and see the movement and see how dynamic the world is, that's going to be very, very sorely affected. So the end of this story comes to tell us, Yaakov, the one who had everything to cry about and everything to be miserable about, he picked up his pieces and he ultimately was able to get back into the land. He was able to bypass his Amalek. He was able to bypass and make it through his meeting with his brother to get into the land. But why? Because he kept moving forward, he kept plowing through, he kept using his physical and his mental strength to get him to new places, to get him to places where he can beat those enemies and finally come to a place of peace. And this is for us, all of Perashat Ki Te'se is a lot of mental work. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of energy. We're going to call these thoughts and these forces enemies, but God is saying, Netano beyado, I give them to you in your hands. You can do it. You have what it takes, and you will be the conqueror. And I hope and pray that we soon are able to find this place. It's a battle every day. It's not a one-day thing and then you win and it's over. It's something that's constant. And we're in constant state of movement. And I thank you all for joining us, because learning is the greatest way that we could grow and we could move. We move out every time we learn one new thing. We actually change the cells in our brain, and we are now propelled to a new way of thinking. Keep learning, keep growing. I hope Hashem gives me the privilege to learn and study together with you. And have a beautiful, beautiful week. You can feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like. I'm reading here some very nice, thank you, some very, very nice things. Let me see if I could scroll up. Thank you. I did mean Ki Te'se. I don't know if I didn't say that. I apologize. Yeah, it's a good word, the subconscious. That's a very good word. And there's a very long, Esther wrote something very long. Let me see if I could see it. He needed help from the women. Yes, beautiful, Esther. Oh, I see there's more to it. If we get to a point about how do we get out of the notion of feeling of being in a situation where it feels like worse than death. I hope I touched on that. If Esther's still here, she asked a question at 11:30. I think moving forward and just put one foot in front of the other and recognize that we're not alone in this, that the greatest, our avot, our imahot, they all had struggles. And that's why today I decided to, there's a beautiful line in Amos, I wonder if I could remember it, where it says that Yisrael, the virgin Yisrael is fallen and she could no longer arise. It's in the 5th chapter of Amos. I don't know, maybe the 2nd pasuk, I'm not sure. I don't have my Tanakh in front of me, but it was very beautifully translated, I think, by the Hasidim to say that when we fall, the point that we are our lowest, it doesn't mean that we can't get up. It means that we can't go any higher, because the point of our fall is the opportunity for us to actually reach our greatest heights. We can't go any higher than the place that we can go once we're low. Picture a ball. The harder you hit it down, the higher up it can go. It's a beautiful verse. If I remember, I'll try and bring it to you. It's in Amos chapter 5, that part I'm sure. But I thank you all for listening and wish you all a beautiful week. You can unmute if there's something you wanted to say. Is my thing not here? Because I'm not hearing anybody. Let me see. Oh, yeah, it's on. Let's see.